I'm probably an unfamiliar face. I work within the subject area of education and early childhood studies. I only joined LJMU last August after finishing off my PhD at Lancaster University. Unbeknownst to me and Phil, we were actually doing our PhD at the same time at Lancaster. So today I am going to be talking about the findings that emerged from my PhD, particularly regarding educational practitioner perceptions of parenting skills, but in relation to parents of children with behavioural, emotional and social difficulties, or BESD. This was a real small part of my PhD, which more broadly looked at homeschool relationships and special educational needs. I also did cover mental illness as well, stigma surrounding having a parent with these kinds of difficulties, but today I'm just focusing on educational practitioner perceptions. So today I'm firstly going to start off by highlighting how parents of children with these kinds of difficulties attracted intense criticism from educational professionals. So 3 terms were used to describe the parents of children with BESD, which were dysfunctional, living chaotic lives, and having no boundaries in place for their children. But I'll then move on to identify how professionals felt they had to intervene where these problem families were concerned by compensating for the poor parenting and supporting the well-being of pupils with BESD themselves. So we'll think about the impact that had on their role as well as on pupils with BESD. But just to briefly put this into context, at present there's a major political focus on parental determinism. In other words, parenting is seen as the key factor which influences a child's well-being, development and achievement. And so the result of this is that parents and home circumstances are often held wholly accountable for the difficulties experienced by their children, such as low achievement and inappropriate behaviour, but also for much wider issues like childhood obesity and this supposed falling standards in schools. So interventions have focused on trying to make parents more responsible, with strategies involving parenting classes, for example, parenting helplines, teaching parents how to be better parents, supposedly. So we've moved away from what once was the privacy of family life towards much state and practitioner interventions into parenting and parenting skills. So basically, parents are often seen as lacking in competence and certain groups of parents are seen to be failing. Now, one group of parents attracting much criticism is those who have children with BESD. So frequent references are made to the inappropriate parenting of pupils with BESD when their children experience these sorts of difficulties, with suggestions that they're bringing up their children without a moral framework. And this was really exacerbated by the 2011 riots in many UK cities, where much of the antisocial behaviour displayed by many children and young people was attributed to a lack of parental responsibility. That was seen as the cause of this inappropriate behaviour. But during my PhD, I wanted to basically explore parental blame and parental responsibility on a micro level and give voice to educational practitioners working with pupils with BESD and their parents on a regular basis. So this interest in parental blame really stemmed from my first research question there. And this led to really interesting insights from educational practitioners regarding the incredibly critical attitudes they had towards these parents. But whilst I was generating this data, I felt that there was another question that needed to be answered, which was how are the needs of pupils with BESD being addressed? How is their social and emotional well-being being addressed whilst we're making these attempts to develop parenting practices? So basically there'd been a lot of attention on improving parenting, implementing parenting classes, etc. But there'd been a lack of consideration of how are we supporting pupils with BESD whilst these parenting practices were ongoing, these parenting schemes were ongoing. So I explored those research questions via interpretive phenomenological analysis, bit of a mouthful, or IPA. So IPA is a qualitative research approach which focuses on gaining an in-depth understanding of how participants make sense of their experiences. Now IPA is a relatively new approach. It was only introduced by Jonathan Smith in the 1990s. But it does seem to be gaining pace now within the UK. More specifically, I conducted individual, semi-structured interviews with educational professionals, and they ranged in length from 30 minutes to over 3 hours, so some teachers had an awful lot to say in this domain. And then sampling, I interviewed 15 educational practitioners for, as I say, this part of my PhD research. 7 were employed in mainstream schools, whilst the remaining 8 worked at schools specifically for pupils with BESD. So all practitioners worked with pupils with BESD, but those employed in specific BESD schools worked intensively with many pupils with BESD on a daily basis, and so gave more sort of detailed interpretations of these pupils and their families. Okay, so it gets to the interesting bit then. So findings. Firstly, I'll highlight really how BESD was seen to be caused by parenting, according to practitioners. So parents of children with BESD were intensely blamed by the teachers supporting their children. And I heard these 3 phrases come up time and time again. Chaotic lives, pupils with BESD were living chaotic lives. They lived in dysfunctional families and no boundaries were in place. So for example, Jackie, a mainstream teacher, talked about it being downright bad parenting of pupils with BESD, children being dragged up, and that these children's problems are just because of dysfunctional families. Sam, the teacher at a BESD school, again talked about no boundaries, living chaotic lives, them being dysfunctional, and that parents are responsible for their children's difficulties. And then finally, Jenny talked about, again, no boundaries, chaos, and also a totally different family setup. Okay. Now, there was also what was referred to by one practitioner, Jean, as a clash of 2 worlds. And this was also referred to by Jenny, if I just go back, a totally different family setup. So different to who? Basically it appeared to be different to practitioners' idea of an appropriate family setup. Now I have talked about this in another paper I've written recently, but basically the bad parenting, in other words chaos, dysfunction and no boundaries, we seem to be clashing with the ideals and expectations of parenting that teachers held in high regard, which according to Stephen and Elaine were structure, stability, routine for the children, and also boundaries in place. Okay, so that just very briefly gave you an insight into the views of practitioners. I know I've said it, but I do want to reiterate that those 3 phrases were used by all practitioners in all interviews numerous times. Okay, so teachers were really damning of parents of children with BESD, incredibly critical. But I'll just move on now to highlight then how practitioners felt that they had to compensate. So what was the impact of parents being blamed for their children's difficulties? Well, according to the teachers I interviewed, it led to them feeling that they had to support the needs, support the personal and social needs of pupils with BESD themselves. So going back to my title, really, good practitioners were deemed to be those who felt a moral obligation to intervene when bad parents weren't able to support their children. So for example, Lorraine talked about being a surrogate mum for the child, rooting for these children because nobody else is, because their parents weren't. Jean talked more about teaching the children skills, social skills, how to control their emotions, how to get on a bus without swearing, those kinds of things. And importantly, skills that parents would usually teach their children. Jenny and Stephen talked more about medical needs, having to take the children to the doctors, get them inhalers, buying them shoes and clothes. I went into one BESD school and walked in and the floor was covered in trainers, socks, t-shirts, etc. And I asked why, and it was because teachers had to get these children clothes because they didn't have any. So again, that well-being role was a major part of these teachers' lives. And then finally, with regards to findings, practitioners talked about not just being an educator to these pupils. They also had to adopt the role of social worker, child protection officer, nutritionist, parent, and also friend in a way. And practitioners talked about the lines between being an educator and an unqualified social worker had become particularly blurred. So linking this then to the literature base, really there is a lot of research which highlights this blame towards parents of children with BESD. And so the practitioners that I interviewed seem to be influenced by this parental determinism approach of our government. But this is arguably a really narrow and simplistic view. And this is because parenting can't be seen in isolation from the wider socio-economic circumstances that parents find themselves in. So parents who were unemployed, living in poverty, experiencing domestic violence, substance abuse, etc. All of those issues are going to impact on the way that parents support and relate to their children. And yet it's seen that practitioners weren't recognising that. With regards to practitioner compensation, Nick Clegg in 2011 recognised this multifaceted role of practitioners, them taking on all of these additional roles, but suggested that they aren't surrogate parents. Now this evidently contrasted with my research where practitioners genuinely felt they were acting as surrogate mums and dads for pupils with BESD. So the implications of this: parenting was being viewed in isolation from the wider socio-economic environment. I've also totally breezed over the issue of social class. just whack it in there at the end. Yeah, I totally acknowledge that. But good parenting was seen to equate to middle class parenting practices. Why is it that the idea of a good parent links to these ideas of middle class parenting, supposedly? And also, evidence state intervention where problem families are concerned. But if practitioners didn't take on these responsibilities, who would be supporting pupils with BESD? So recommendations then, well, we need to be encouraging practitioners to move away from blaming parenting per se and recognising the wider environment. So, parenting doesn't come in isolation, it's influenced by this wider socio-economic circumstances. In terms of practitioner compensation, well, if teachers are going to adopt these additional roles and responsibilities, they need the time and training to do so. And, I understand that's not easy, not just with regards to financial implications, but if it means that if teachers aren't taking on these additional responsibilities, pupils with BESD may not be supported. It's something we do need to think about. Also reinforces the need for multi-agency collaboration, joined up services, and for policy to recognise the needs of pupils as well as their parents. Okay, so to conclude then, bad parents are supposedly those who don't take responsibility for their children, with those who have BESD basically being everything a parent should not be, according to practitioners. So good practitioners intervene and feel a moral obligation to support the needs of these pupils. So really my research has just recognised the intensely critical perceptions that practitioners held, but also the major pressures and responsibilities that they were under with regards to supporting pupils with BESD. So I just want to finish though on a quote from Daniel, a head teacher at a BESD school, who suggested that in Britain there's a culture of overcompensating for people who can't manage their own lives. They can't manage their lives, so let's do everything for them. And it takes away a level of responsibility that the parents ought to be taking. So I'd just like you to think about whether you agree or disagree. So should practitioners be intervening in supporting pupils with BESD, or does it take away a level of parental responsibility? But if they didn't intervene, who would be supporting the needs of pupils with BESD? And that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
A few minutes for questions. Do we have any questions? Anna.
I think that's really interesting, and that was really interesting. It's not a topic I know much about at all. So I think I just wanted to ask, given that so much of it is around kind of moral judgment of parenting styles, and what does the evidence say? Is there much research around parenting styles, and is there much research that kind of contradicts this or that actually backs this up? Or
there is a lot of research around the idea. Well, I wouldn't say a lot. There is a research base around the idea of a good parent, and in relation to education, that's suggestions of, you know, they participate in their children's education but leave the teaching to teachers. But really, in terms of middle class parenting, it was this suggestion of there is support around the idea of we need to put routine in place for our children, we need to discipline them in a particular way. And so really, my research was recognising that, well, practitioners had these perceptions and they were influenced by this middle class idea of parenting, and yet these parents that I was focused on weren't living up to this parental ideal, basically.
I think one of the issues is that the pathologisation of behaviour and bad behaviour is really quite a recent phenomenon, and I work with a local charity, the ADHD Foundation, and one of the things that the charity has identified is that a lot of parents of children with ADHD themselves have undiagnosed ADHD, or they show ADHD-like characteristics, but my students used to tell me that I show ADHD-like. Don't know quite how that one's going on. But I do think that's interesting, but interestingly, in relation to that, I think that sort of imposition of a certain type of parenting reflects, it has the negative side as well. I'm not saying you're saying that's necessarily positive, but a student of mine whose daughter has really quite severe ADHD, who has also ASD, so she's on the autistic spectrum, it's often comorbidity, and has also got dyslexia, and has chosen to put her child on Ritalin, was given a lecture by her social worker about how inappropriate it was to medicate her child's behaviour, and she's saying, if I don't medicate my child's behaviour, I'll probably kill her, or if I don't, an awful lot of other people will do, because her child's behaviour was so problematic in the way our society is structured at the moment that medication was the only solution for her. And she's very angry about what she sees as somebody who doesn't live with the situation, making presumptions about what it's like to live with the situation. Where does the chaos come from? Is it chaotic parenting, or is the chaotic parents a response to children who live chaotic lives because of their condition?
And that's another area I did explore as well. Firstly, this intergenerational continuity of ineffective parenting. We parent how our parents have parented us, and how do you, goes back to the clash of two worlds, how do you change that when it's so ingrained in generations and generations of parenting, you know, this appropriate way of parenting. And also empathy, that when I spoke to parents, they said teachers have no idea what the situation is that I'm dealing with my child, you know, up the wall 24/7. I get up at 3 in the morning every day, so when I come to school to drop him off at 9 o'clock in the morning, I've been up 6 hours having hell, basically. So it's these perceptions, these views that I've shared today from practitioners. Of course, they look incredibly critical, but I do want to say that they were really committed to these families. I'm pretty sure they wouldn't, share these views with parents themselves. However, it does indicate that actually parenting is being viewed in isolation. It was poor parenting, it was dysfunctional parenting. Well, what about the, you know, they've got no support in place at home, there's domestic violence, there's drug use going on, etc. What about that bit? Because you can't ignore that bit. So that was sort of, yeah, part of what came out.
It's fascinating debate. Unfortunately, we've got time for it. So I'm really sorry, Mark. I know it's something that a lot of people want to